What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as hocks42 on the internet, and today we have another edition of the Overthinking MTG podcast, the unscripted, unedited show where I talk for about 10 minutes on an individual Magic card. And today we're going to keep looking at some of the aftermath spoilers. Today specifically, I want to talk about Urborg Scavengers. Spoiler warning, I like this card. I think it's fun. So this is a spirit. It's a 2/2 for 2 and a black. Whenever Urborg Scavengers enters the battlefield or attacks, exile target card from a graveyard. Put a +1/+1 counter on Urborg Scavengers. And Urborg Scavengers has flying, as long as a card exiled with it has flying. Same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. So basically, if you have a creature in your graveyard that has a cool keyword, Urborg Scavengers can exile it, and there you go. It's any graveyard. So if your opponent has a creature in their graveyard that's looking especially tasty, you can actually exile it and boom, Urborg Scavengers are online. This is especially notable in a world with Atraxa in basically every format imaginable. Because if your opponent is playing some kind of Atraxa Reanimator deck, or if your opponent, well, is me and is therefore playing some kind of Atraxa Reanimator deck, there's a good chance this is going to hit like gangbusters, because not only are you going to be exiling the Atraxa out of their graveyard, which is exactly where they want it, but your Urborg Scavengers are then going to enter in the battlefield and immediately become a 3/3 with flying, Death Touch, Lifelink, and Vigilance. I mean, that's great. And then if you attack again, once you attack, it becomes a 4/4 with all those stats. Like, the fact that these things keep growing is excellent. Additionally, you have to exile a card from a graveyard. That is a meaningful detail. So if the only card in a graveyard is something that you would like to stay in your graveyard, I highly recommend not triggering an Urborg Scavengers. That might mean missing out on a very opportune attack. Be aware of that. Now, that scenario is not super likely because instants and sorceries are going to get played, creatures are going to get killed and sacrificed, and, you know, they're in older formats, you got fetch lands and whatnot. So there's going to be stuff to exile. So you know, that's not really going to be a huge deal in most scenarios, but you never know. So this card's really strong, frankly, and you can run it in scenarios where you can have some control over what's in your graveyard. That said, you're probably not going to want, like, if you're in a situation where you want to put Atraxa in your own graveyard, the last thing you're going to want to do is exile it. You want to get it onto the battlefield somehow. You know, if you want to reanimate Atraxa and you end up eating it with your Urborg Scavengers, unless you have lethal the next turn because you did exactly that, that's going to feel really bad most of the time. Because that's a resource you are losing out on. You are spending a card in your graveyard that you could have gotten for something else. Because you'll notice Urborg Scavengers doesn't have the Atraxa ETB. So you don't draw the whole bunch of cards as a result of this entering the battlefield. You just get all the keywords on a much smaller body. Now, those keywords are all fantastic, and so even on a 3/3, especially when you only pay 3 for, that still feels awesome. Don't get me wrong, that's still very, very strong. But it's far more likely that you're going to be appreciative of opportunities when your opponent gave you that chance. So running this alongside cards that mill is going to be useful. You know, if you're trying to mill your opponent out, one of the risks of running a mill strategy is going up against somebody who can leverage their graveyard, whether through flashback cards or reanimation stuff. So if your opponent has any kind of reanimation package, I don't know if you've been on the receiving end of this or been the person doing this, but there's nothing that feels worse than when you're milling your opponent out and you mill them down and you mill the biggest bomb that they have into their graveyard and then they immediately reanimate it the next turn. That feels awful. That said, as a reanimator player myself, there have been plenty of times when I've been looking at a Diregraph Rebirth or a Cruelty of Gix in my hand thinking, man, I wish there was something in my graveyard. And then my opponent will down-tick a Jace and dump an Atraxa into my graveyard, or, you know, in some of my, you know, older decks, I guess it wasn't Atraxa, but they would dump some big 7-drop into my graveyard, and it's like, all right, cool, thanks. That just made my life a lot easier. And then all of a sudden, we're off to the races and cool things are happening. So that's one of those things. Actually, one of my favorites is when they would use Jace, and I would discard a Cemetery Desecrator that I would then reanimate and kill their Jace. That was like my favorite move. Didn't work a ton, but man, when it did, it was great. So, and we have much better options now, but there's a time when that was a legit option. But anyway, Yeah, Urborg Scavengers is a very interesting card. You're going to want to use this as graveyard hate primarily. I wouldn't be surprised if like the current mono blacklist looks at this as a fine option, especially once Graveyard Trespasser rotates out. That card is really strong because of the gain and drain and the ward. So I don't think Urborg Scavengers is going to replace, you know, the Great Cemetery Trespasser anytime soon. Or it is Graveyard Trespasser, whatever. That darn wolf that has been eating my Atraxas, and I don't appreciate it. This card is comparable to that, and I think it could fill that slot if the mono black deck remains a thing after rotation. Rotation is going to hit the mono black deck real hard, so it's going to have to change. Like, they're going to have to pivot how that deck functions, but at the same time, they are maintaining a lot of beefers, beefcakes, beefy cards. A lot of good stuff is sticking around. They hold on to Sheoldred, and rotation, by the way, happens in September, which is a number of months away from this recording. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but that's honestly kind of what I see with this card in Standard. I don't expect it to be good now. But once we lose a lot of the bomb 3 drops that deck is currently leveraging, this all of a sudden steps up. That said, Liliana the Veil is a thing right now, and I don't believe, and she's not rotating. She came in Dominaria. So Lily is here and will remain here. Sheoldred is here, will remain here. Phyrexian Fleshgorger is also here competing for the same slot, and I think he's probably going to take it more often than not. So Urborg Scavengers looks almost like sideboard tech if graveyard decks are popular. If graveyard decks are not a tier 1 deck post-rotation, I don't see this card even showing up in sideboards, but it's neat. I like this card. It reminds me a lot of Soul Flare, which was a card that was printed in Fate Reforged. That was a 4/4 for 6, 4 black, and it had Delve, and it soaked up keywords, much like this, for creatures that you delved with it. So if you exiled, you know, a creature with flying, Death Touch, and Trample or whatever out of your graveyard, to help pay for Soul Flayer's cost, it would enter the battlefield with those keywords. So it was similar to Urborg Scavengers, except it was one time. It was whatever you delved with, that was the Soul Flayer you got. And in a lot of cases, that was a 4/4 with some nasty keywords for 2. I mean, that's pretty good. You can do some good things with that, and there were some crazy decks that were leveraging that to really good effect. And Urborg Scavengers kind of gives me that vibe. However, Urborg Scavengers gets bigger every single turn as you're attacking. So as it ETBs, it enters the battlefield, you immediately exile the thing and put a counter on it. So it's a 3/3 right out of the gate. Like, it's a 2/2, but not really. And then by the time you're attacking with it, you get a 4/4. After that, if you attack with it again, it's a 5/5. If you're aggressive with this card, your opponent will not be allowed to set up a graveyard-centric strategy, and you have them on a very aggressive clock because this thing grows over time, and there's a good chance it'll be evasive in some way. All right, so actually, okay, last episode, I recorded earlier today, but we looked at Deification, which is a card that I really liked, and the more I talked about it, the less I liked it. With Urborg Scavengers, the exact opposite is happening. I thought it was like a cute, fun card that would have some decent implications, but the more I talk about it, the more I realize it might actually be a pretty real player. So in aggressive strategies, in aggressive black strategies, if the meta is a place where you can soak up some decent keywords out of people's graveyards, if you can get this thing trample, or if you can get this thing flying, that's really like, I think flying is really where you want to be. Then all of a sudden, this card becomes really good. Really good. That said, if it incidentally eats your Tenacious Underdog, you're going to feel pretty bad. But all in all, I think it's a cool design. I like this thing a lot. I don't generally love Graveyard Hate, only because it targets my favorite strategy. But I respect good design when I see it, and that's what I see here. You know? Having something that's designed to shut me down, I respect it, because I'm abusing a big part of the game. Like, the graveyard is a very easily abusable, hyper-powerful element of the game. There need to be good answers for it. And so this giving you a decent body that's worth playing and it incidentally hates on your opponent's graveyard, cool. I dig it. And in a world where Atraxa exists, this might line up against a couple of meta decks in the not too distant future in some pretty powerful ways. Because this idea of like, oh man, if I untap next turn, I'm going to get Atraxa out and everything's going to be great. And the opponent's like, no, you're not going to get Atraxa. Also, by the way, this thing has 4 massive keywords and it's going to be swinging at you very soon. I like that. It's fun. Also, actually, fun fact, if you have a creature that has haste in a graveyard, if you can exile a creature with haste with this, give it haste, then attack. you could actually be swinging with a 4/4 that has all those keywords as early as turn 3. That's pretty good. If the situation arises, like if the scenario lines up. Actually, maybe there's a Rakdos aggro deck running things like Monastery Swiftspear and Urborg Scavengers in our near future. I'm gonna have to tinker with that because that's pretty good. So if your opponent answers the Swiftspear, kills it, puts it in the graveyard, Urborg Scavengers can now come in with haste and start hitting on their graveyard and punch in their face. Ooh, I like this. The more I think about this, the more I like it. So, all right. I think I have some testing to do with this card once it drops. So I'm looking forward to that. So anyway, thank you for checking out this edition of the Overthinking MTG podcast, available on YouTube and anywhere fine podcasts are available. Yeah, I appreciate it. And I will catch you on the next one.